Have you ever sat down in your seat, only to be asked to stand up because someone else looked more important? It's a small moment, but it makes you wonder, is a person's worth measured by their first-class ticket, or by the dignity they carry? That day, in the middle of a VIP cabin, lit up like a stage, a silent black woman was asked to switch seats with a wealthy white passenger. Little did she know that. She was the CEO of the very airline they were boarding. That moment posed a painful choice that any of us may face in our lives between suffering in silence or standing up to protect our own dignity. If it were you, in the moment of being ignored, how would you react? Would you choose to be patient to avoid trouble? Or would you choose to confront to protect what is right? This story isn't just about discrimination. It's about dignity. It's about truth. And about one man standing up to remind the world that everyone deserves respect. We invite you to join us on this emotional journey. If the story touches your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel to continue accompanying us on our next healing stories. The cabin lights of Flight SR218 glowed in a warm, dim gold, the kind of light meant to soothe travelers before a long, cross-country trip. It was early evening at Denver International Airport, and through the windows of the Skyreach Airlines Airbus A350, the sun was dipping behind the jagged shadow of the Rockies. Most passengers were still boarding, careful, tired, dragging the weight of their day in rolling suitcases and quiet sighs. In Seat 1A, by the wide curved window of the VIP suite, sat a woman who looked like she belonged to no particular category at all. Not rushed, not anxious, not trying to impress anyone. She simply was. Her name, unknown to everyone around her, was Charlotte Hayes. Her sweater was simple, a soft charcoal gray. Her jeans were worn in the way denim looked after years of living, not buying. Her hair was pulled into a low, tidy bun. No jewelry except a slim silver bracelet on her right wrist and a pair of stud earrings. She held a paperback in her lap, one thumb tucked inside to keep her place. At first glance, Charlotte looked like a woman who had worked a long week and just wanted a quiet flight home. No one knew she was the CEO of the very airline they were flying. No one knew she had once been named one of the 100 most influential women in America. No one knew she was the architect behind Skyreach's turnaround, the woman who saved the company from collapse during a brutal recession. Tonight, she was just another face. And tonight, that was exactly what she wanted. But the universe had a way of testing people when they least expected it. The aisle rustled with movement as a sharply dressed flight attendant hurried forward. His nameplate read, Ethan Clark. He had the posture of a man who believed good service started with knowing who mattered and who didn't. Behind him followed a woman whose presence pulled the attention of half the cabin. She moved like she expected space to open in front of her without asking. Her heels clicked in crisp, impatient taps. Her perfume left a sharp floral trail. Victoria Langford, a familiar type on premium flights, polished, powerful, and permanently displeased. Her expensive white coat draped over her arm. Her diamond studs reflected the overhead light. Her lips pressed tight as if she'd tasted something sour the moment she stepped on board. She glanced around the VIP cabin, the way people glanced into refrigerators looking for something better than what was there. Then her eyes fell on 1A, on Charlotte. And everything shifted. Victoria leaned toward Ethan, whispering loudly enough that anyone within 2 rows could hear. "This isn't happening. My assistant booked me the window suite. I always sit in 1A. Ethan nodded quickly. Too quickly. "Yes, ma'am. I understand. Let me check your boarding pass." Victoria waved the paper in his face like it was an accusation. "Check, I don't need you to check. I know where I'm supposed to sit. My husband arranged this with your corporate office. I'm not sitting anywhere but 1A. Her voice was polished, steel-cold, sharp, designed to slice. Charlotte, still quiet, lifted her eyes from the book, not defensive, not frightened, just aware. She inhaled slowly through her nose, the way she'd been taught in mindfulness training years ago. A slow breath to see the moment for what it was. A test, and she wasn't sure, yet, whether she was ready to take it. Ethan straightened his shoulders and walked to Charlotte's seat. He softened his tone only slightly. "Ma'am, may I see your boarding pass? Please." Charlotte offered a Smallky's polite smile and handed it to him. No hesitation. Ethan's eyes flicked over it. A twitch of irritation crossed his face so fast an untrained eye would miss it. Then he leaned closer. "Ma'am, it appears there might have been an error. This seat was supposed to be held for a VIP member. We'll need you to relocate to seat 3D. It's still in the premium cabin." His voice was gentle on the surface, but the subtext was hard enough to bruise. Charlotte looked at him for a quiet second. "I understand your request," she said, her voice low and calm, "but this is my assigned seat." Victoria scoffed behind him. "Are you serious?" she snapped. "You're really not moving." Charlotte didn't turn her head. She kept her gaze on the flight attendant. "Yes," she answered softly. "I'm staying in the seat I paid for." Ethan's expression shifted from forced patience to something colder, more rigid, a mask of authority he was too comfortable wearing. "Ma'am, we need this seat for a passenger who has priority with our airline. Please gather your things." His hand hovered near her arm, close enough to insult, not close enough to touch. Charlotte placed her bookmark between the pages and closed the novel gently, as if she were giving herself one more breath before facing the storm. Then she looked up. Her eyes were steady, not angry, just deeply, deeply tired. "I heard what you said," she replied. The answer is still no. The air tightened. A passenger in 2A lifted his phone, pretending to check email but angling the camera just enough. Victoria stepped closer, her voice dripping disdain. "This is ridiculous. I don't know what kind of upgrades you people get, but you need to move. I have a connection to make in D.C. My husband is Senator Langford. I don't sit in second-rate seats." There it was, the part of the American experience Charlotte knew too well. "You people," said casually, carelessly, confidently, said by someone who never expected consequences. Charlotte felt that old familiar ache beneath her ribs, the one she thought she had outgrown by now, the one she carried since childhood like an invisible scar. Still she breathed. Still she didn't raise her voice. Still she didn't break posture. "Ms. Langford," she said gently, "your seat is 1C, not mine." "I don't want 1C. I want that one," Victoria hissed, pointing like the seat was a possession stolen from her. Ethan stiffened. His jaw tightened. "Ma'am," he said again, this time with authority sharpened by embarrassment. "If you don't cooperate, I'll have to call security." Charlotte blinked. Slowly. She felt every passenger now watching her, judging her, assigning her a story they thought they already knew. She felt her heart beat once, heavy, then again, steadier. If she complied, nothing changed. If she resisted, everything changed. But resistance came with consequences, ones that could blow up bigger than this cabin. Her fingers traced the edge of her bracelet. The metal was cool against her skin. Her mother's voice returned. "When they expect you to break, baby, stand still. Not for them, for yourself." So she stood still, in her voice, in her place, in her truth. "I'm not moving," Charlotte said, calm as a still lake. "Call whoever you need to." It was not loud, it was not dramatic, but it was the sentence that would unravel the entire flight, and set off a chain of events no one on that plane was prepared for. Not Ethan, not Victoria, not the silent passengers leaning forward, and certainly not the woman in seat 1A who was about to change an airline's future without ever raising her voice. Charlotte Hayes had always understood that moments like the one unfolding on Flight SR218 didn't begin inside airplanes, restaurants, office buildings, or conference halls. They began long before that, shaped by childhood memories, old wounds that never truly healed, and the lessons passed down quietly through generations. As she sat in 1A, steady under the pressure of Victoria's entitlement and Ethan's looming threat, Charlotte felt something she had not felt in years, not anger, but memory. A soft ache, familiar in the way an old injury stirs when the air changes. Her fingers brushed the spine of the book resting on her lap. She didn't open it. Instead, she looked toward the cabin window. Outside, a fuel truck rumbled, ground crew moved with practiced efficiency, and the last streaks of sunlight dipped beneath the horizon. The sky turned the dark blue shade she always loved the color before night truly arrives. This moment, this confrontation, this pressure to shrink or stay standing, it wasn't new. It had simply returned. Her thoughts drifted back to the first time she ever felt this sensation. She had been 9 years old. Detroit, early winter, wind biting at her cheeks as she walked home from school. The collar of her too-thin coat pulled high. Back then her world was small, stitched together with her mother's night shifts, the hum of the old radiator in their apartment, and the sound of gospel music that played softly through the walls on Sunday mornings. She remembered the cafeteria more clearly than she wished she did, the crowded tables, the plastic trays, the way kids sorted themselves into groups without ever being told. She remembered approaching a table where 3 girls sat, girls she had laughed with the week before during recess, and one of them had looked at her, scrunched her nose, and placed her backpack on the empty seat. "You can't sit here," the girl had said, without shame or hesitation. Why, Charlotte had asked, genuinely confused. The girl shrugged. "My mom said people like you shouldn't mix with us too much. People like you." She had no idea what that meant at the time. She learned quickly. That night, she told her mother, Rita Hayes, exhausted from a 12-hour shift at the hospital, set her lunchbox down and knelt on the kitchen floor so she could look her daughter in the eyes. "Baby, listen," Rita said softly. "Some folks carry fear like a coat they never take off. They'll try to make you wear one too. Don't you take it. Don't let them decide your worth." Then she pulled Charlotte into her arms, rocking her gently, humming the tune of an old soul song. That memory had shaped Charlotte far more than any award, any promotion, any speech she'd ever given. A part of her had grown strong because of it. Another part had grown tired. She exhaled, slow and quiet, back on the plane. Ethan was still standing in front of her, trying to decide if he should escalate the situation or step back. Victoria hovered beside him, vibrating with impatience, as if the very air offended her. Charlotte could sense eyes on her, weighing her, calibrating assumptions. Was she being difficult? Was she causing a problem? Was she one of those passengers? The truth was far simpler. She had simply reached a point in her life where the cost of silence was heavier than the cost of being seen. She shifted her posture slightly in the seat, not defensively but deliberately, grounded, present, unmoved. Inside, however, her thoughts were more complicated. She wasn't invincible. She wasn't carved from stone. She was a woman who had carried expectations on her back her entire life, expectations from colleagues, family, communities who cheered her victories as symbols of hope. She carried the pressure of being the first in too many rooms, the first black woman to lead a major U.S. airline, the first CEO in Skyreach history to come from outside the executive pipeline, the first leader to inherit a nearly broken culture and still believe it could be rebuilt. Being first always meant carrying more weight than anyone admitted. Her position was powerful, but her humanity was still tender. That tenderness lived quietly inside her, especially on nights when she flew alone. She looked at Victoria now, looked at the rage twisting the woman's face over something as small as a seat, looked at Ethan's posture, stiff with misplaced authority, looked at the uneasy silence of the cabin. It hit her. Then this wasn't just another small incident. It was a symptom, one she had suspected for months. She remembered the reports. The complaints from passengers who felt unseen or mistreated. The whispers inside boardrooms about the VIP program becoming a culture of favoritism rather than service. The tension she'd sensed among crew members during unannounced inspections. Charlotte had planned this undercover flight to observe without being noticed, not to be challenged, not to be provoked, not to be humiliated. But perhaps the truth had arrived earlier than expected. She wondered for a split second if she should reveal who she was right now, end the argument, end the theater of entitlement in front of her. But that would defeat the purpose. Power only reveals truth when it is hidden. If she announced her title, everyone would behave, everyone would perform, everyone would lie by pretending they were being professional all along. So she stayed quiet, not to protect herself, but to see clearly. Her mother's voice echoed again. Strength ain't in the noise you make, baby, it's in the calm you hold. She held on to that calm. Ma'am, Ethan repeated, voice harder now. You're preventing us from completing pre-departure procedures. Please cooperate. Charlotte met his eyes, and something in her gaze made him flinch a softness that held steady, refusing to be intimidated. She knew people like him, employees who climbed the corporate ladder through proximity rather than integrity, people who mistook customer service for hierarchy rather than hospitality. You're making this very difficult, he muttered. I'm not, Charlotte answered. You just don't like the answer. The words weren't sharp. They weren't a jab. They were simply true. Victoria let out a bitter laugh. Unbelievable. They'll hand out premium seats to anyone now. This airline used to have standards. Charlotte didn't look at her. She didn't need to. But she felt something shift inside. A quiet breaking point. Not from anger, from recognition. These were the same voices she had heard all her life. In school, in college. In corporate rooms where she was the only one who didn't fit the mold. In meetings where her ideas were ignored until repeated by someone else. In moments when she won awards, only to hear someone whisper that she must have been a diversity pick. And now, here on a plane she was responsible for running, she was being told again to move aside. Her throat tightened, not with tears, but with conviction. She would not move. Not this time. Not for anyone. Ethan spoke again, voice strained. Ma'am, if you continue to refuse, I'll have to escalate this. Charlotte inhaled deeply, grounding herself. Do what you need to do. The entire cabin held its breath. Ethan blinked, uncertain now. Victoria scoffed, turning red with indignation. Several passengers exchanged glances, and Charlotte sat still, poised like a stone carved out of grace. She felt no triumph, only the weight of a truth she had carried too long. The world still hadn't changed as much as she hoped, but she had. She was no longer the little girl told she couldn't sit at a lunch table. She was no longer the young woman who worked twice as hard to be seen half as clearly. She was no longer the rising executive pressured to smile through disrespect. She had earned her place. In this seat, in this company, in this moment, she would not shrink for anyone. Outside the window, darkness settled fully over the airfield as the aircraft prepared for its departure checks. Inside the cabin, something else was beginning, an unraveling, a reckoning, a truth long ignored, and for Charlotte Hayes, this was only the beginning of a night she would never forget. Hours before Charlotte Hayes ever stepped onto Flight SR218, long before the confrontation with Victoria Langford, and long before Ethan Clark stood over her issuing demands he wasn't authorized to make. She had been sitting alone in her office at Skyreach headquarters. It was late afternoon. The city outside her window pulsed with the hum of Denver traffic. Sunlight reflected off the glass buildings and cast faint gold streaks across her desk. Papers were stacked neatly. A half-finished cup of black coffee sat beside her laptop, and a folder marked Internal Findings waited for her to open it again. Charlotte pressed her fingertips lightly on the folder's edge, feeling its weight before lifting the cover. Inside were reports that had become increasingly frequent during the past year. Passenger complaints describing curt treatment, allegations of staff ignoring travelers who didn't look wealthy enough to matter, concerns about a growing gap between how elite members were treated versus everyone else, comments from junior employees who felt pressured to prioritize status over compassion. The words echoed in her mind. Favoritism, entitlement, prejudice, unequal service. Even more troubling were the anonymous internal memos from crew members who described a cultural shift subtle but unmistakable. A shift toward catering to wealthy travelers with an almost servile urgency, while treating regular passengers as inconveniences to manage. One note in particular stayed with her. "We are losing what made this airline human. We are serving status, not people." Since taking the CEO role, Charlotte had fought to restore dignity and trust within Sky Reach, but the deeper she went, the more she realized that cultural decay often hid beneath polished surfaces. Employees smiled in public, yet whispered concerns in private. Some leaders nodded in meetings but resisted every change the moment she walked out of the room. She knew this flight would tell her more about the truth than any report could. That was why she booked the ticket under a simplified version of her name. No corporate credentials, no assistant, no entourage, no advance notice to the crew. Just Charlotte, a woman flying alone, carrying only a small suitcase and a paperback novel. She wanted to see the airline the way ordinary passengers experienced it. Unearned privilege had a way of distorting reality, and she refused to live inside that distortion. In the days leading up to the trip, she had prepared herself for a quiet flight, a chance to observe, to watch interactions, assess service patterns, and gather honest impressions. She expected she might see a few awkward exchanges, a hint of impatience, maybe even some inconsiderate behavior. She did not expect what was unfolding now. Back on the plane, Charlotte watched Ethan shift his weight nervously. He still hadn't decided whether to call security. His authority existed only in his belief that she lacked any power of her own. Victoria Langford was growing irritated that her demand remained unmet, tapping her heel on the carpet with rising impatience. Neither of them had the faintest idea that the woman they were trying to remove from 1A had spent the last 8 months working to rebuild the very airline they represented. Charlotte felt a mixture of sadness and clarity as she observed the two of them. Sadness because the behavior she was witnessing was more blatant than she imagined. Clarity because it confirmed what the reports had been warning her about. The problem wasn't hidden. The problem was standing right in front of her. She leaned back in her seat, letting her thoughts drift to conversations she'd had with the board just weeks ago. Some members expressed quiet concern about public perception. Others wanted to boost profits fast, no matter what compromises were made along the way. A few insisted Skyreach needed to prioritize its highest spenders aggressively if it wanted to compete with luxury-tier airlines. That message had started as strategy. Somewhere along the way, it had turned into permission. Permission for people like Ethan to make assumptions about who deserved respect. Permission for passengers like Victoria to believe the airline existed to serve her alone. Permission for small abuses of power to accumulate quietly until they became the norm. Charlotte had disagreed with that direction from the start. Hospitality, she believed, was rooted in equality. Service meant showing dignity to all passengers, not only those paying for premium seats. Airlines were bridges, connecting people from different backgrounds, incomes, and stories. To strip that down to status was to strip away humanity itself. And right now, she sat inside the proof that her instincts had been right. A faint announcement echoed through the cabin, the captain reminding crews to finalize preparations. Charlotte closed her eyes briefly. She needed to stay calm, not because she feared what would happen next, but because she knew she had to stay fully present to see every detail. Her trips undercover were always emotional. She learned more from quiet observation than from any polished report. They reminded her of her mother's wisdom, reminded her to never forget what it felt like to be overlooked, reminded her why she took this job in the first place, to build a company that treated everyone with fairness. She opened her eyes again. Ethan had stepped aside temporarily to speak with another flight attendant. She caught fragments of the exchange, something about calling the ground supervisor. Victoria crossed her arms and stared at Charlotte with a look that blended irritation and disbelief. Charlotte let her gaze shift to the other passengers. Some watched openly. Others pretended to read. A few looked uncomfortable. She wondered how many of them had faced similar moments in their own lives, situations where dignity was tested in small, quiet ways. She wondered how many chose to stay silent, how many fought back, how many still carried the memory, just as she carried hers. A man 2 rows back gave her a tiny, almost invisible nod, just enough to acknowledge that he saw what was happening, that he understood, that he recognized something unfair in the air. It strengthened her resolve. She understood the risks of remaining still. She understood the storm approaching. But she also understood something deeper. If a leader couldn't stand in the uncomfortable spaces, how could she ever ask her employees to do the same? She thought of the training sessions she wanted to implement. Sessions focusing on human empathy. Sessions teaching how bias, conscious or not, influenced treatment. Sessions reminding staff that every passenger carried their own story, just as she carried hers. This flight, she realized, would become part of that plan. Not because she wanted revenge, not because she wanted attention, not because she wanted to punish anyone, but because cultures didn't change through policy alone. Cultures changed because truth surfaced in undeniable ways. Tonight, truth had arrived in row 1A. She saw Ethan approaching once more, determination etched into his face. He had made his decision. She felt the cabin tighten as he prepared to enforce his misguided authority. Her heartbeat remained steady. Her posture remained calm. Her purpose remained clear. She was here to observe. But observation had turned into confrontation. Confrontation was turning into something larger, and somewhere deep inside her chest, a quiet certainty formed. This moment would define far more than a single flight. It would define the direction of the entire company she led. Long before the confrontation in the VIP cabin, before Charlotte Hayes even arrived at the airport, another conversation had taken place in the private lounge reserved for elite Skyreach travelers. It was a space designed for exclusivity-dimmed lights, polished marble counters, sound-insulated walls, and staff trained to anticipate desires before they were voiced. This was the world where Victoria Langford felt most at home. A server had just set down a glass of chilled white wine when Victoria's assistant whispered something into her ear. She nodded, as if the world always rearranged itself to her convenience. Her tailored cream suit didn't wrinkle, her hair didn't shift, and her expectations remained as high as the heels she wore. Across the lounge, a man in uniform approached. Ethan Clark, already in his crew attire for the upcoming flight, stopped at a respectful distance. He wore a smile sharpened by ambition. He had long ago learned which passengers were worth catering to, and Victoria Langford was a name he recognized instantly. Mrs. Langford, he greeted, offering a subtle bow of his head. "Always a pleasure to have you traveling with us." She returned a thin, approving smile. "I assume everything is arranged for my seat." Ethan's eyes flickered. "Let me confirm. You prefer the window in 1A. "Correct, I don't just prefer it," she said. "I require it. It wasn't unusual for her to speak that way. She came from a world where entitlement was inherited and reinforced, where demands weren't requests but expectations delivered as statements of fact. Ethan had built his entire career around serving the powerful. He shook his head internally whenever he thought about company values emphasizing fairness. Fairness, in his mind, slowed down service. Prioritizing certain passengers made operations smoother, made ratings higher, and earned praise from those who mattered most. He leaned closer. "It should be yours, but I'll check the manifest personally. Don't worry, I'll take care of it." Victoria swirled the wine gently in her glass, barely acknowledging him. "Make sure you do." Ethan left the lounge with a brisk stride, the promise of favor warming him like a quiet reward. Moments later, in a more secluded part of the lounge, Victoria received a brief phone call. She lowered her voice, glancing around to ensure no one was within earshot. "Yes. I'll speak to the chairman this week," she whispered into the phone. "If Skyreach wants the committee's support on the aviation grant, they'll need to keep delivering for their premium clients." She paused, listening. "Of course I'll mention their service. That's why I always sit in 1A. Visibility matters." The call ended. Victoria smoothed her coat with a single motion, satisfied with the leverage she believed she held. What she didn't understand, what she had never bothered to understand, was that power did not excuse cruelty, and entitlement was not a mark of status, only of insecurity. Back in the crew preparation room, Ethan gathered with the rest of his team. They reviewed safety protocols, seating assignments, and special requests. It was supposed to be routine. Yet Ethan's tone had a certain edge when he spoke about the VIP section. "We've got Mrs. Langford traveling with us tonight. She prefers seat 1A, he said, glancing around as if expecting admiration. One crew member raised an eyebrow. "The seat's already booked." Ethan dismissed it with a flick of his hand. "Then we'll handle it. These things happen all the time. Some passengers don't mind shifting around." Some passengers. His phrasing carried an assumption he didn't say aloud, assumptions shaped not by policy, but by bias. Another crew member asked, "Did corporate actually approve that seat reassignment?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "I am the senior attendant on this flight. I can approve it." He couldn't. Not officially. Not ethically. Not without consequences. But when someone believed they were untouchable, rules felt negotiable. Meanwhile, Victoria Langford boarded the aircraft before most passengers. She swept down the aisle like someone inspecting property she expected to find in perfect condition. When she spotted another traveler, someone ordinary, someone quiet, someone black already seated in 1A, irritation flared immediately. She turned sharply to Ethan. "Fix it," she whispered sharply. Eyes narrowed. "I don't care how. Just do it." That was how the confrontation began. But it wasn't how the problem began. Problems rarely start in dramatic moments. They begin in quiet spaces, in whispered lies, in unchecked entitlement, in small abuses of influence. As Victoria stood near 1A, waiting for what she assumed would be immediate compliance, she had no idea that the woman she was attempting to displace had more authority over Skyreach Airlines than anyone in the crew could dream of. She didn't know Charlotte Hayes had spent the past year trying to dismantle the cultural rot seeping into the company. She didn't know Charlotte had inherited a leadership team resistant to reform. She didn't know Charlotte was the reason Skyreach had changed their hiring guidelines, their training modules, their support systems. She simply saw a black woman sitting in the seat she wanted and assumed the airline must have made a mistake. Control was something she craved. And when control was threatened, she reacted with cruelty disguised as expectation. Ethan, meanwhile, clung to the idea that pleasing elite passengers was his path to influence. He never saw how such blind dedication made him vulnerable. He never realized how close he was to crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The crew around him sensed something was off, but he held the highest rank on board. His subtle arrogance, polished by years of being rewarded for pleasing the wealthy, was rarely challenged. Charlotte watched all of this unfold without rushing to reveal her identity. She could have ended the conflict with one sentence, "I am the CEO of Skyreach Airlines." But she didn't. Because this moment wasn't about her title. It was about seeing the truth of her company without filters. She wanted to witness how people behaved when they thought no one important was watching. Now she had her answer. Victoria's voice cut through the cabin once more. "This shouldn't be difficult. I shouldn't even have to ask." Charlotte absorbed the hostility without flinching. It wasn't the first time she'd seen this face of entitlement, but it still made something inside her tighten, something that reminded her why she took this job in the first place. Skyreach didn't need a CEO who hid behind boardrooms and polished media statements. It needed a leader who understood the everyday experiences of passengers, especially the ones overlooked, dismissed, or mistreated. This flight was exposing a deeper truth than she expected, a culture shaped not only by big policies, but by small decisions. Employees who quietly bent rules to please the powerful. Passengers who believed luxury entitled them to bend others' dignity. A system that rewarded speed and status more than empathy and integrity. It was the very thing she had feared, and the very thing she intended to change. The weight of that responsibility pressed on her chest for a moment, not crushing her, but reminding her of the significance of this night. She took a slow, steady breath, the kind of breath a leader takes when the mission becomes unmistakably clear. The truth had revealed itself, and soon the consequences would follow. By the time most passengers had settled into their seats, the atmosphere inside the VIP cabin of Flight SR218 had taken on a strange, uneasy stillness. Conversations dropped to murmurs. Pages of magazines stopped turning. Attention hung in the air like static before a storm. Charlotte Hayes could feel it pressing gently at her shoulders as she sat in 1A. Her novel closed now, resting quietly on her lap. She wasn't reading anymore. She was watching, observing, absorbing every detail around her with the same patient focus she once used while learning flight routes as a trainee and reviewing complicated budget sheets during Skyreach board meetings. But tonight, she wasn't analyzing numbers. She was analyzing people. The flight attendant, Ethan Clark, stood rigid only a few steps away, arms crossed behind his back with a formality that felt forced, like a man trying to look certain while his certainty was slipping. His eyes flicked toward Victoria Langford, who hovered just behind him, her face flushing with impatience. Victoria's fingers tightened around the strap of her designer bag. Her expression was sharp as cut glass, her breath shallow with indignation. She was used to efficiency, instant compliance, a world rearranged the moment she demanded it. And yet the woman in seat 1A remained unmoved. That alone was enough to agitate her. Charlotte shifted slightly in her seat, not defensively, but with the composure of someone who had long practiced choosing stillness in situations where others expected submission. Her calm presence irritated Victoria further, who took it as defiance rather than dignity. From the row behind, a middle-aged couple exchanged uneasy glances. The man whispered something to his partner, who shook her head gently, signaling not to get involved. A young business traveler glanced over nervously, thumb still hovering above his phone screen. The Latino passenger who had begun discreetly recording earlier kept his device low but steady. Every small motion in the cabin felt amplified. Ethan cleared his throat. "Ma'am," he said again, voice clipped, "we cannot start the departure process until you relocate. Please gather your belongings." Charlotte looked up, her eyes steady but not confrontational. "I heard your request," she replied softly. but I'm not moving from a seat assigned to me." Her tone wasn't combative. It was factual. It was anchored. But to people unaccustomed to being told no, even calm truth could feel like challenge. Victoria stepped closer, her breath sharp and hot in the cooled cabin air. "You're holding up the entire flight," she snapped. "If you can't afford the right seat, that's not my problem." A collective intake of breath rippled through the surrounding rows. The statement wasn't whispered. It wasn't muttered. It was clear, cold, and meant to degrade. Charlotte absorbed it with quiet dignity, but she felt something stir inside, an old, familiar ache wrapped in steel. She didn't respond to Victoria. She didn't need to. Ethan tried to regain momentum. "Mrs. Langford is a valued Skyreach partner. We have an obligation to ensure her comfort." Charlotte's eyebrow lifted just a fraction, at the cost of another passenger's seat. "It happens," he replied, shrugging slightly. "We do our best to keep premium guests satisfied." "And what exactly am I?" Charlotte asked, her voice still low, still steady. Ethan blinked fast, thrown off by the question. "Well, ma'am, I don't have information about your status level." The implication floated in the air like a stain. Status dictated worth. Status dictated treatment. Status dictated who should yield. Charlotte felt the truth of Skyreach's cultural decay settling into focus, sharper now than any report she had read. She didn't need to see more. She had seen enough. Victoria let out an impatient sigh, stepping directly in front of Charlotte. "Is this what this airline has become? Giving first-class seats to?" She stopped just short of finishing the sentence, but the silence that followed spoke the words for her. Charlotte met her gaze briefly. She saw entitlement. Yes, but underneath it, she saw fear. The kind of fear that thrived in people who convinced themselves their power was permanent. "My seat assignment is correct," Charlotte said quietly. "You're asking for something that isn't yours." The simplicity of the statement rattled Ethan. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration edging into his voice. "I've already contacted the ground supervisor. If you won't cooperate, you may be removed from the aircraft." Gasps rose from several passengers. Someone mumbled, "This is too much." Charlotte felt her pulse in her wrist not racing, just present. She breathed once, deeply, letting the breath settle her. Then she spoke, not loudly, but clearly enough for Ethan to hear. "Are you certain that's the action you want to take?" Ethan stiffened. He misunderstood the question entirely. He took it as a passenger bluffing, not as a soft warning from the one person on board who could end his career with a single report. "Absolutely," he said. "I have full authority to enforce compliance." Charlotte nodded once, almost sadly. "Then go ahead." Another whisper spread through the cabin. Victoria's eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Finally," she muttered, crossing her arms, but her confidence wavered slightly when she noticed the passenger in 2A recording with more intention now, his posture upright, his face serious. She glared at him, but he didn't look away. Ethan raised his chin and turned to walk toward the front galley to make the call. But before he took more than 2 steps, the cabin lights flickered briefly, a signal from the flight deck. A coded notification crew members knew well. The captain needed to speak with him now. Ethan's brow furrowed. He gave Charlotte a suspicious look, as if she somehow caused it, and made his way forward, disappearing behind the galley curtain. Victoria rolled her eyes dramatically. "Unbelievable. This is exactly why some people shouldn't be in premium cabins." The words were meant to intimidate. Instead, they revealed everything. Charlotte inhaled slowly. She didn't respond. She knew silence could be far more powerful than argument, especially when the truth was beginning to shift. A moment later, the curtain moved aside. Ethan reappeared, but the confidence he shown earlier had drained from his posture. His steps were slower now, his expression slightly unsettled, as if something from the cockpit had shaken him. Charlotte watched him closely. She noticed the faint sheen of sweat at his temple, the tension along his jaw, the way his throat bobbed as if swallowing nerves. He approached her again. "Ma'am," he said, voice less firm now, "I need to verify something with you. May I see your identification?" Charlotte studied him for a second before responding. "Of course." She reached slowly into her bag. The movement was calm, deliberate, respectful of the uneasy tension in the cabin. She took out her wallet and held it open in her hand. Ethan leaned closer. His eyes scanned her ID. First the picture, then the name, then the title. He blinked once, as if his mind had misread, then again. The color drained from his face. Charlotte didn't move, didn't speak, didn't gloat. She simply watched him realize the truth he had been blind to all along. Victoria, noticing his reaction, frowned. "What is it now?" "Can you please finish this? I have places too." She froze when Ethan stepped back abruptly, swallowing hard. His voice came out thin. "Mrs. Langford, I need a moment." He turned again toward the front cabin, shoulders tight, walking faster than before. Charlotte remained perfectly still. She looked out the window at the quiet tarmac lights. Something inside her shifted, not triumph, but heavy clarity. The unraveling had begun. Ethan Clark moved quickly through the front galley, his heartbeat knocking sharply beneath his uniform. The lighting overhead hummed in the narrow space, but that sound was drowned out by the rising static in his mind. Something inside him had cracked the moment he read the name on the ID card. Charlotte Hayes. He had heard that name in countless briefings. Every Skyreach employee had, a name tied to restructuring, innovation, ethical reform, and relentless expectations. A name that lived in the company's training manuals and leadership videos. A name he had just threatened to remove from an aircraft. He reached the cockpit door, pressed the call button, and waited. When it slid open, Captain Andrew Foster looked back at him with a puzzled frown. "You took a while," the captain said. "We need to finalize our numbers." "What's going on?" Ethan hesitated. "Captain, I need to confirm something with you." The first officer, Maya Jenkins, glanced over her shoulder. "Is it about the cabin issue?" "We saw your message." Ethan swallowed. His voice shook despite his effort to steady it. I think we have a much bigger problem. The passenger in 1A. Her ID says she's Charlotte Hayes." Silence hit the cockpit like a slammed door. Captain Foster blinked, confused at first, then startled. "Hayes, as in our CEO." "Yes, sir." The first officer straightened in her seat. "Are you sure it's not fake?" "No," Ethan whispered. "It's the black executive pass. The crest is real. The strip is real, and when I saw it, everything in me just stopped." Captain Foster rubbed a hand over his jaw, exhaling sharply. "God help us." Ethan tried to maintain posture but failed. His shoulders sagged. "Sir, I think I've made a terrible mistake." Captain Foster's tone hardened. "Explain." Ethan's throat tightened. He couldn't hide it anymore. "I tried to reassign her seat so another premium passenger could have it. Mrs. Langford demanded a switch. I pushed for compliance. I threatened a downgrade." His voice broke slightly. "I said I'd have her removed." The first officer closed her eyes in a pained wince. "You didn't." "I did." The captain pushed back from his seat and stood. The motion was slow but heavy, like someone absorbing the weight of consequences. He looked directly at Ethan. "You are aware of company policy, correct?" "Yes, sir. And you know the CEO has absolute authority over every Skyreach flight." "I know. Then you also know she has the right to investigate, evaluate, or intervene at any time. Ethan nodded shakily. I understand. Captain Foster inhaled deeply and stepped toward him. Here's what you will do. You will remain calm. You will not attempt to fix this on your own, and you will not speak to her until she addresses you. He paused, lowering his voice. She needs to speak with me first. Ethan felt sweat gather at his hairline. Is she angry? I don't know, the captain replied. That's what worries me. The cockpit fell into silence again, thick and suffocating. After a moment, Captain Foster nodded to the first officer. Maya, hold departure. Log a delay for internal review. I'm stepping out. Yes, Captain. Captain Foster opened the cockpit door and stepped into the galley. Ethan stood frozen for a moment, then followed quietly. Inside the cabin, the tension had deepened. The passengers sensed that something had shifted, though no one understood the scale of it. Victoria Langford sat with her arms folded tightly, foot tapping with irritation. Beside her, her husband Michael had arrived from the business cabin to join her after hearing there was a delay issue. His voice was a low murmur as he questioned her. What did you do this time? Vic, but she ignored him. Charlotte Hayes remained in 1A, posture tall, gaze resting calmly on the window. The city lights glowed faintly on the tarmac, reflections dancing on the glass like small, patient flames. When the captain entered the cabin, several passengers straightened, others whispered. Victoria raised her chin triumphantly, as if expecting support. Captain Foster walked past her without a glance. He stopped in front of 1A and lowered his voice respectfully. Ms. Hayes, may I speak with you? Charlotte turned her head, meeting his eyes. Something in her expression softened slightly. Of course, Captain. He drew in a steadying breath. Ma'am, I apologize for the disruption. I was not informed you were aboard. That was intentional, Charlotte replied gently. I wanted to observe quietly. Yes, ma'am, he said, almost swallowing the words. If you would allow, I'd like a brief moment to discuss the situation in private. Or here, if you prefer. Here is fine, Charlotte said. Her tone was calm enough that passengers nearby leaned in subtly, trying to read her mood. Captain Foster nodded. Very well. I understand you were asked to relocate. Charlotte's gaze flicked briefly toward Victoria, then back to him. Asked is generous, but yes. The captain cleared his throat. Ms. Hayes, I just received confirmation of your identity from our internal system. I am deeply sorry for how you were treated. Thank you, she said softly. Ethan stood behind the captain, his hands clasped so tightly they trembled. Victoria mistook the formality for vindication. Finally, she lifted her chin toward the captain. Good. Now, can we remove this woman? She has refused to comply for almost 20 minutes. Captain Foster turned slowly, his expression changing in a way that made the entire cabin go still. Mrs. Langford, he said, you may want to reconsider your tone. Victoria blinked. Excuse me. He stepped slightly aside, revealing Charlotte fully in his line of sight. Mrs. Langford, he continued, you have been addressing the chief executive officer of Skyreach Airlines. It hit the cabin like a shockwave. Audible gasps rose from nearly every row. The recording passenger straightened in astonishment. Michael Langford's mouth fell open. Victoria stared at Charlotte as if the world had tilted. Then she shook her head, scoffing. She's not the CEO. That's impossible. The CEO is older, and she doesn't look like she stopped herself, but the unfinished sentence landed anyway. Charlotte met her gaze with quiet steadiness. You were saying, Victoria stammered, voice cracking. This can't be real. The captain's tone sharpened. It is. Ethan's face paled to the color of paper. He whispered, barely audible, "Ms. Hayes, I'm so sorry." But she didn't look at him yet. Her attention remained on Victoria, whose composed facade was crumbling. For the first time, she truly saw Charlotte not as a woman occupying a seat she wanted, but as someone who held authority far beyond anything she or her husband possessed. Charlotte spoke, her voice soft but unmistakably firm. "Mrs. Langford, you requested a seat that wasn't yours. You insulted a stranger. And you leveraged your wealth as if it entitled you to disregard another person's dignity." Victoria swallowed hard. But no words came. Charlotte continued. "This cabin has rules. Not just Skyreach rules, rules of decency, humanity. You broke them." Michael spoke cautiously. "Ms. Hayes, can we resolve this quietly?" Charlotte turned to him with kindness. "Not anger. Mr. Langford, I have no dispute with you, but your wife's behavior put my staff in an impossible situation, and it revealed a deeper issue I came here to see for myself." Her gaze shifted finally to Ethan. He straightened, bracing for the blow, but Charlotte didn't raise her voice. She didn't lecture. She simply said, "Mr. Clark, meet me after landing. We'll discuss your choices today." It wasn't a threat. It was a sentence shaped like mercy, but heavy enough to crush a career. The cabin remained silent, breaths held, waiting for what came next. Captain Foster stepped forward. "Ms. Hayes, how would you like to proceed?" Charlotte leaned back slowly, her voice warm yet steady. "We'll continue the flight," she said, "but Mrs. Langford will remain in her assigned seat, and she will not speak to me again." Victoria's cheeks burned crimson. She shrank into her seat, trembling. Charlotte added gently, "This flight will be a long one. Let's see if we can make it peaceful." Nobody argued. Nobody dared. The cabin felt different now. It wasn't loud. It wasn't chaotic. It was something heavier, a quiet that clung to the air like static before a storm. Every passenger, from the first row to the aisle near the curtain, watched Charlotte Hayes with a complicated mix of awe and disbelief. Even those who had not witnessed the earlier confrontation sensed a shift in gravity. Charlotte rested her hands gently on her armrest. Her expression was collected, but Ethan Clark could see the restrained weight beneath her calm surface. She was thinking, processing, not lashing out, and that terrified him more than if she had shouted. Captain Foster exhaled once, then addressed the nearby passengers with a steady voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We'll be underway soon. Thank you for your patience." But patience was not what filled the cabin. Curiosity did, anxiety did, respect did, and something else, the awareness that they had all just witnessed something important. Victoria Langford sat rigid beside her husband, hands clenched in her lap. She stared straight ahead as though hoping the world might forget what she had said. Michael lowered his head, quietly mortified, pressing a hand to his brow. "A few rows back," someone whispered. "That's the CEO for real." Another voice answered. "I swear I saw her in that big Skyreach feature last year. The turnaround video, the one about employee reform." A woman across the aisle breathed. "Well, at least she handled it with grace. I would have lost my mind." This last comment floated softly toward Charlotte. She didn't react, but a shadow of reflection passed across her face. She had not lost her composure today, but inside her chest lay a tightening sensation, fatigue mixed with disappointment. She hadn't wanted to be recognized. She hadn't wanted to step into authority. She had simply wanted to observe and understand the truth of what her employees lived and what her passengers endured. Instead, she'd been forced into the center of the very problem she'd come to study. Maria Cortez, The supervising flight attendant on duty hurried toward the galley. Her face was pale, her steps careful, mindful of the tension still lingering in the aisle. She approached Ethan quietly. "Are you okay?" she whispered. "No," he said, barely audible, not remotely. Her eyes softened. "I saw what happened. It wasn't good, Ethan, but it isn't unsalvageable. She's fair. She'll listen." Ethan shook his head. "I crossed every line we were trained not to cross." Maria didn't deny it. Instead, she touched his arm lightly. "Then make it right when you can. That's all you have now." Before he could respond, Captain Foster stepped behind them. "We need a quick briefing." His voice was firm, not angry. Maria and Ethan joined him at the small crew station. "We cannot afford another misstep," the captain said quietly. "Ms. Hayes is observing everything. I need both of you at your best." Clear Maria nodded immediately. Ethan did too, even though his throat tightened. "Good," Foster continued. "Maria, you'll manage the cabin like normal. Ethan, you focus on safety tasks only. Limit passenger interaction unless necessary." Ethan swallowed hard. "Understood." The captain looked at him a moment longer. "I know you're shaken, but you still have a job to do." Ethan felt the sting of guilt again. "Yes, sir." When the captain returned to the cockpit, Maria lingered. She looked at Ethan with a mix of empathy and worry. "Take a breath. We're not done yet." Ethan exhaled shakily. "Thanks." Back in the cabin, Charlotte reached into her small bag and retrieved a leather-bound notebook. She opened it slowly, feeling its familiar texture settle her nerves. She began jotting quiet notes, each word capturing the truth she had witnessed, the landscapes of behavior that needed reshaping. Behind her, the first passenger in business class cleared his throat. "Ms. Hayes." Charlotte turned slightly. "Yes?" The man looked nervous, but sincere. "I just wanted to say thank you. It means something to see a leader carry herself the way you did." Charlotte gave a small, warm smile. "Thank you for saying that." Another woman nodded from across the aisle. "Some of us saw the whole thing. You didn't lose your temper. That matters." Charlotte held their gazes for a moment, letting their words rest inside her. She appreciated kindness when it wasn't performative, but her thoughts drifted. A childhood memory flickered, uninvited. She was 12 again, standing in a crowded grocery store with her mother. A stranger had pushed past them and said, without hesitation, "You people move too slow." Her mother had stayed calm, poised, dignified, and later told her, "Baby, you'll face people like that all your life. What matters is that you never become like them." That memory lived deep in Charlotte's bones. It held her together on days like this. She closed the notebook. Maria approached then, her posture straight, her voice measured. "Ms. Hayes, would you like a pre-departure drink? Water? Sparkling? Or wine?" Charlotte considered her. Maria was careful but not fearful, respectful but not performative. Charlotte appreciated that. "Sparkling water, please," she replied, "of course." As Maria stepped away, Charlotte caught the tiny tremor in her hands. The crew felt the pressure. She expected nothing less. Scrutiny weighed heavily on those who cared about their work. On the opposite aisle, Victoria swallowed thickly. She shifted in her seat, clearly bothered by the flight attendant's attentive service toward Charlotte. The irony that she could no longer request anything without fear of making things worse clung to her like heat. Michael glanced at his wife. "You need to stay quiet. I mean it." She didn't answer. She kept her gaze fixed on the tray table as if unable to face anyone. Finally, the cabin lights dimmed slightly as the engines hummed to life outside. The plane vibrated with a subtle power rising beneath the floor. Passengers eased back into their seats, fastening belts, settling small bags, preparing themselves for departure. Maria returned with the sparkling water, setting it gently on Charlotte's tray. "Let me know if you need anything else." "Thank you," Charlotte said. "You're doing well." The compliment shook Maria slightly. She nodded and turned away before emotion could crack through her professionalism. The intercom dinged. Captain Foster's voice filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We are cleared for departure. Please take your seats and prepare for takeoff." Seat belts clicked. Conversation lowered to a hush. The engines grew louder, a deep, controlled rumble. Charlotte looked out the window again, watching airport lights flicker across the wing like fireflies. The tension in her chest eased a little, but not entirely. She knew this flight had already revealed more than she'd planned to confront in a single day. But there was still more to understand, more to see, more to fix. As the plane began rolling, Ethan stood in his jump seat, back straight, breathing unevenly. He watched the cabin through the narrow gap between two partitions. He watched the passengers settle. He watched Charlotte take a small sip of her sparkling water. And he felt the weight of what was coming once they reached Chicago. Consequences, conversations, maybe even an ending. The aircraft turned onto the runway, engines rising to a roar. Charlotte closed her eyes. Ethan prayed silently. Victoria bit her lip until it trembled, and the plane accelerated. When the wheels lifted from the ground and the cabin tilted upward, the world below shrank away. But nothing that had happened on the ground stayed there. For some passengers, this flight would be memorable. For others, transformative. For a few, it would mark the beginning of an unraveling. And for one woman in seat 1A, it marked something deeper, a renewed resolve to fix what was broken, a promise she had made long before she wore a title, a promise to herself. As the plane reached cruising altitude, the cabin softened into a dim, mellow glow. Passengers loosened shoulders, let out long breaths, and allowed the tension of the earlier confrontation to dissolve into the hum of the engines. But for Charlotte Hayes, the quiet sky only magnified what stirred inside her. She rested her fingertips gently on the cool aluminum of the armrest and gazed out into the soft darkness beyond the window. Clouds drifted below like folds of linen, illuminated by the faint glow of the moon. She often found peace in the stillness of flight. Tonight, the peace didn't come easily. There was a heaviness in her chest, unspoken yet vivid. An old familiarity she wished she had forgotten. Disrespect came in many forms, sometimes sharp, sometimes disguised in silk. Tonight, it had come dressed in entitlement and wrapped in assumptions. She had expected to blend into the cabin. She had expected anonymity. But she had also expected professionalism. Fairness. She had wanted to witness operations without interference. Instead, she had been reminded of something she'd learned young: hiding one's success never protected anyone from prejudice. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "Ms. Hayes. Sorry to bother you." Charlotte turned slightly. It was the recording passenger, the man from 2A. He stood respectfully in the aisle, hands clasped, careful not to impose. "Yes," she answered warmly. He spoke gently. "I just wanted to tell you, what you did back there meant a lot. Some people never see how those moments play out. I did, and I'm grateful." She nodded. "Thank you, but I wasn't trying to prove anything." "I know," he said, smiling a little. "That's why it landed harder." He hesitated, then added, "My name's Daniel. By the way, I'm heading to Chicago for my sister's graduation. I didn't think I'd witness something like that before the weekend even started." Charlotte gave a polite smile. Congratulations to your sister. Thank you. Daniel shifted. Thoughtful. If it's all right, I'll stop recording. I didn't expect things to escalate. I just saw something unfair. Charlotte appreciated the sincerity in his eyes. Your instincts were good, but you can do what feels right. He nodded and slipped back to his seat. The gesture warmed her because it wasn't born from shock or fear. It was simple decency. Behind him, an elderly woman across the aisle caught Charlotte's attention. Her hands were wrapped around a cup of tea. She leaned slightly toward Charlotte and whispered, "Your mother raised you well." Charlotte's breath caught. She didn't answer at first. The woman smiled softly. "I could tell from the way you held yourself. It reminded me of my daughter. She had to deal with a lot, too. Hard things, unfair things." Charlotte felt something tighten in her throat. "Thank you. That's very kind." The woman nodded, then returned to her tea. No lectures, no assumptions, just human recognition. These small kindnesses held more weight than most people realized. Across the cabin, Victoria Langford was noticeably quieter. She sat stiffly, her hands trembling slightly as she sipped water. She had not spoken since learning Charlotte's identity. The arrogance that had filled her earlier had collapsed into something fragile fear mixed with humiliation. Her husband, Michael, rubbed his temples, choosing silence over confrontation. Even he seemed aware that any misstep now could deepen the damage. In the galley, Maria Cortez checked the service cart, but her eyes drifted toward Charlotte every few seconds. A mixture of admiration and apprehension filled her face. She respected leadership, especially the kind that responded with restraint, but she also knew Ethan's fate was tied to what came next. Ethan himself remained seated in the jump seat, staring blankly at the small instructions panel across from him. His mind replayed every moment of the confrontation, every word, every assumption, every mistake. He didn't fear losing his job as much as he feared disappointing someone who had worked tirelessly to rebuild a company he loved. His voice wavered in his mind. "I'm not a cruel person," he whispered to himself. "I didn't mean, but intent didn't erase impact." Finally, Captain Foster made his way down the aisle again, stopping beside Charlotte's seat. "Ms. Hayes, is there anything we can provide to make your flight more comfortable?" She turned from the window, meeting his steady gaze. "No. You and your team are doing what you can in a difficult situation." He exhaled with relief. "Thank you. I want you to know that we take your safety and comfort seriously, and I am truly sorry for what happened before departure. I appreciate that. Captain." Her tone softened. "I know this isn't easy for you either." He hesitated before lowering his voice. "With your permission, when you address the crew after landing, I'd like to be present." Her brow lifted slightly. "That won't be necessary." "But I feel responsible," he insisted. "No, Captain," she said gently. "You responded appropriately once you learned the truth. You stood firm. That matters." The words seemed to lift something off his shoulders. He gave a respectful nod. "Thank you, ma'am." When he left, Maria approached with a warm towel and set it on Charlotte's tray. "Just in case you need it," she said quietly. Charlotte smiled at her. "You're doing very well, Maria." Maria blinked at the unexpected praise. Thank you, Ms. Hayes." She stepped away quickly, flustered but grateful. The aircraft continued its quiet journey through the night sky. The cabin lights dimmed further as passengers eased into rest. But Charlotte couldn't sleep yet. Her thoughts drifted again, this time deeper, into a place she often kept private. She remembered her first solo flight as a young manager, years before she became CEO. She had been denied an upgrade then, too, told she didn't look like corporate, It was said casually, as if harmless. She'd swallowed the remark, told herself to focus, told herself she'd earn the world's respect one day. But respect wasn't something you earned only once. It was something people tested again and again. Charlotte sighed softly, letting her head rest back against the smooth seat cushion. She felt no anger left in her, only a quiet ache mixed with clarity about what needed to change. She whispered inwardly, almost like a promise to herself, I didn't come here to expose anyone. But I won't ignore what I've seen. She closed her eyes briefly, absorbing the hum of the engines. Somewhere in the cabin, a child laughed softly in his sleep, a gentle, innocuous sound. It grounded her. When she opened her eyes again, she felt a renewed steadiness in her chest. For all the ugliness she'd experienced that evening, there had also been goodness, Daniel's decency, the elderly woman's warmth, Maria's professionalism, the captain's respect. These fragments mattered. They reminded her that the world wasn't only made of people like Victoria, it was also made of people who chose kindness when they had nothing to gain. Charlotte drew in a slow breath and leaned forward slightly, fingers brushing the window with quiet intention. This journey was far from over. Outside, the night wrapped around the aircraft like a deep velvet curtain. But dawn always came, and with it, clarity. The cabin lights dimmed further as passengers settled under thin blankets. The kind airlines always provided lightweight, slightly scratchy, yet strangely comforting at 35,000 feet. Outside, the night sky stretched endlessly. A soft ocean of darkness broken only by distant flashes of star-white light. Charlotte Hayes sat still in 1A, her breathing slow, her hands folded gently over her notebook. She tried to let the drone of the engine soothe her, but her mind continued tracing over the events before takeoff, replaying each moment like a sequence she needed to understand fully. Leadership demanded reflection. But reflection was often painful. A soft ding sounded overhead. The captain's voice floated through the speakers. Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting a patch of unstable air. Please return to your seats and fasten your belts. The passengers stirred. A few murmured nervously. Charlotte pulled her belt snug with practiced ease. Moments later, a gentle bump shook the cabin. Then a stronger one. The plane dipped slightly before leveling again, prompting a ripple of gasps across the rows. Charlotte steadied her breath. She'd flown often enough to understand turbulence, but even then, the sensation of losing balance in the sky always carried a primal jolt. Maria Cortez moved quickly down the aisle, checking seatbelts with firm but calm movements. Please secure your items, she reminded softly. We'll be pausing service for a moment. When she reached Charlotte's row, she paused briefly. Are you comfortable? Charlotte nodded. Yes. Go take your seat. Maria gave a grateful smile and moved toward the jump seat near the galley. Ethan was already strapped in, staring at the cabin with tense anticipation, the overhead lights casting a pale glow across his worried features. Maria settled beside him and whispered, Breathe. It's just air pockets. I'm not thinking about the turbulence, Ethan murmured. I'm thinking about after we land. Maria sighed. One thing at a time. The aircraft jolted sharply, this time harder than before. A woman in row 3 gasped and gripped the armrest. The elderly lady who had spoken to Charlotte earlier whispered a quiet prayer under her breath. Even Michael Langford, usually composed, held the seat in front of him with white knuckles. But it was Victoria who reacted the strongest. She flinched violently, her breath quickening, her entire body tensing. The arrogance she had worn earlier evaporated under fear. She looked around rapidly, eyes darting between passengers as if desperate for reassurance. The sudden vulnerability softened her features, revealing something she rarely exposed: fragility. A particularly harsh drop made her gasp. Michael. I don't like this." Her husband reached for her hand. "It's okay. It's just turbulence." But she shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "No. I'm scared." Charlotte heard the tremor in her voice. She looked toward Victoria, not with judgment, but with the quiet empathy of someone who knew fear did not discriminate. The plane shook again, long, rumbling, rattling overhead, bends slightly. Someone behind Charlotte whispered, "Jesus, hold us," while another muttered, "I hate flying. I hate flying." The captain's voice came back on. "We're passing through a dense thermal cluster. Please remain seated. Our aircraft is stable." Charlotte closed her eyes, letting the words settle her. Suddenly, she heard a soft thump. She opened her eyes. Victoria's water bottle had slipped from her trembling hands and rolled under Charlotte's seat. The small, helpless sound Victoria made a tiny exhale of distress was unlike anything she'd expressed all evening. Charlotte leaned down, retrieved the bottle, and extended it gently. Victoria hesitated, stunned. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. Thank you." Her voice cracked on the last word. Charlotte simply nodded. No lecture, no coldness, just a quiet act of humanity. The turbulence continued, rattling the fuselage with low, irregular shakes. Daniel from 2A leaned forward slightly, calling out softly, "Everyone okay?" His voice, though calm, carried the tremor of someone trying to reassure himself along with others. Charlotte rested her head back again, focusing on stabilizing her breath. The dips were small now, but enough to keep the cabin on edge. She looked across the aisle at the elderly woman, who offered a thin smile. "Storms always pass," she whispered. Charlotte smiled back. "Yes, they do." Another memory surfaced, unbidden. She was 19, sitting in the back of a rattling bus on a late-night trip between college and home. A storm had shaken the windows, lightning slicing through the black sky. She had clutched her backpack, whispering words her mother had taught her, "Ride through it. Courage grows when you endure." That same feeling washed through her now. Not fear, endurance. After several more minutes, the turbulence eased. The shaking softened to gentle bumps, then faded almost completely. The cabin exhaled in a collective sigh of relief. Maria unbuckled her restraints. "We'll resume service shortly," she called gently. Ethan nodded without speaking, still fighting the heaviness inside him. Passengers shifted. Some rubbed their eyes. Some laughed nervously. The man in row 3 whispered, "Thought my heart was gonna stop." His wife patted his knee and chuckled tiredly. Victoria wiped her face discreetly with a napkin. Her hands still shook. She glanced at Charlotte again, this time with something resembling gratitude and shame intertwined. Michael leaned toward her and whispered, "See, we're fine." She nodded stiffly. "I know. But she couldn't finish the sentence. Charlotte sensed her struggling for composure, and for a moment, she wondered how someone so outwardly powerful could be so brittle beneath the surface. She didn't pity her. She simply understood the complexity of people who lived behind facades. Maria returned with the drink cart once the captain signaled it was safe. She offered beverages with a gentle smile. When she reached Victoria, the woman looked up nervously. "Something warm," Maria asked kindly. Victoria hesitated, then whispered, "Tea, please." Maria poured the drink, set it down gently, and gave her a reassuring nod. Victoria seemed surprised by the kindness. When Maria reached Charlotte, she spoke softly. "Would you like anything, Ms. Hayes?" Charlotte shook her head. "Just continue as you are." Maria's eyes warmed. She understood the unspoken message I'm watching. But I'm not here to punish you. A calmness settled across the cabin again, but Charlotte couldn't shake the lingering weight inside her. She looked down at her notebook and added a new line. Fear reveals truth, and truth reveals what must be changed. She paused, tapping the pen lightly. A second line followed. Leadership isn't in the authority you hold. It's in how you respond when others falter. She sighed softly, feeling the truth of her own words. As the cabin lights shifted into a soft midnight mode, many passengers prepared to sleep. The elderly woman closed her eyes, hands folded peacefully. Daniel reclined his seat, headphones over his ears. Michael rested his head back, already drifting off. Victoria remained awake, her gaze low, her shoulders subtly slumped. She wasn't proud of herself, and she didn't hide it. Charlotte glanced toward her once more. Victoria met her eyes for a single, vulnerable second, and then looked away. The turbulence had passed, but the storm between them had only begun to change shape. The cabin had grown still, truly still. That quiet where even the hum of the engines seems gentler, softened by the weight of sleeping passengers and dim blue lighting. Midnight flights had a way of making everyone feel suspended in time, as if the world below had paused and the sky alone continued its slow, steady rhythm. Charlotte Hayes remained awake in 1A, though her eyes had grown heavier. She seldom slept on flights. Maybe it was habit. Maybe leadership had trained her brain to stay alert even in rest. Or maybe tonight had unearthed too many old wounds to let sleep settle. She shifted slightly, letting her head rest against the cushion. She watched the faint shimmer of the wing lights outside, blinking in slow intervals. Each flicker reminded her of the path ahead landing, conversations, decisions that carried weight beyond this single flight. But in this quiet glow, something else tugged at her attention. A soft sob, barely audible, fragile, coming from across the aisle. Charlotte turned her head gently. Victoria Langford sat upright, shoulders shaking almost imperceptibly. Her husband had fallen asleep beside her, his mouth slightly open, unaware. Victoria held a napkin to her face, pressing it to her lips as if trying not to make a sound. She wasn't crying from fear now. Something deeper was unraveling. Charlotte watched for a moment, not with judgment, but with the cautious empathy of someone seeing the cracks under a person's armor. Victoria wasn't a monster. She was someone who had let privilege shape her lens until she could no longer distinguish confidence from entitlement. Charlotte exhaled softly and looked away, giving her space. Moments later, a whisper reached her. "Why did you help me?" Charlotte looked back. Victoria's eyes were red-rimmed, glossy in the dim light. "I beg your pardon," Charlotte asked gently. Victoria swallowed hard. "When I dropped my bottle, you picked it up. I wasn't expecting that." Charlotte closed her notebook slowly. "I didn't think about it. You needed something." Victoria let out a shaky breath. "After everything I said to you, after how I treated you." Charlotte waited. Victoria continued, voice trembling. "Why weren't you angry with me?" The question hung between them like a suspended weight. Charlotte answered after a long pause. "I was disappointed," she admitted. Anger would have been easier. Victoria blinked fast. "Easier." "Yes," Charlotte murmured. "Anger pushes people away. Disappointment forces us to see things clearly." Victoria lowered her gaze, tears slipping down her cheeks. "I wasn't trying to be cruel." "I know," Charlotte replied softly, "but that doesn't mean cruelty wasn't present." Victoria flinched at the words, but she didn't retreat. For once, she didn't argue or deflect. "I don't know why I act like that sometimes," she whispered, "as if the world owes me something. I wasn't raised like this. My mother was kind. My father, he taught me to be strong. But somewhere along the way," her voice broke, "I turned into someone I don't like. The admission carried an unexpected weight. Charlotte studied her quietly. Victoria wasn't looking for absolution. She was searching for understanding, maybe even redemption. "You're not beyond change," Charlotte said gently, "but change comes when we choose honesty over pride." Victoria nodded weakly. "It scared me," she confessed. "When the turbulence hit, when I realized everything could end in seconds, I suddenly saw how terrible I've been. To you, to others, even to myself." Charlotte softened. Fear strips away masks. Victoria wiped her cheeks with a napkin. "Does it always take fear to see the truth?" "Not always," Charlotte said. "But for some, yes." Victoria hesitated again, then whispered something she never thought she'd say aloud. "I'm sorry." The words were quiet, small, but real. Charlotte held her gaze. "I hear you." She didn't say "I forgive you," not because she refused forgiveness, but because forgiveness was complex, something that needed room to breathe. The moment rested in a delicate balance until a soft knock interrupted them. Maria approached slowly. "Ms. Hayes, Mrs. Langford. Apologies, I didn't mean to intrude. Just checking if either of you needs something." Victoria wiped her face quickly. "I'm fine." Charlotte smiled reassuringly. "Thank you. Maria." "We're all right." Maria nodded and stepped away, glancing back just once, sensing the emotion lingering between them. Once alone again. Victoria let out a long, trembling breath. "You know, when Ethan said you were the CEO, I didn't believe him. I couldn't believe him. I think part of me didn't want to believe someone like you could hold that much power." Charlotte's expression softened further. "Someone like me," Victoria swallowed again. "A black woman," she whispered. "Successful, composed, in control. I built a life believing I was above people, and then suddenly I wasn't. Suddenly, I was the one exposed." Charlotte breathed slowly. "Success doesn't erase prejudice, Victoria, but it can challenge it." Victoria nodded slowly, absorbing the weight of that truth. "Do you ever get tired," she asked suddenly, "of proving people wrong?" Charlotte looked out the window again. Stars glimmered like distant fragments of truth. "Every day," she said softly. "But proving people wrong isn't my work. Building something better is—" Victoria's voice trembled. "I don't know how to be better." Charlotte turned back, her tone warm but firm. "Start small. Start with humility. Start with listening. Kindness isn't weakness, Victoria. It's discipline." Victoria closed her eyes briefly, letting the words settle. When she opened them again, there was something new in her expression. Not confidence, not shame. Resolve. "I don't want tonight to define me," she whispered, "but I want it to change me." Charlotte's smile was faint but genuine. "Then you're already on the right path." For a moment, silence draped itself gently over them. A silence not of tension, but understanding. Across the aisle, the elderly woman opened her eyes softly, watching the exchange with quiet approval. She gave a small nod toward Charlotte, as if blessing the moment. Charlotte returned the gesture. Then Victoria spoke again, voice fragile but truthful. "What will happen to Ethan?" Charlotte breathed in. The question weighed heavily. "We'll talk," she said. "I don't punish people for being human, but I will hold him accountable." Victoria nodded. "He seemed nervous, scared, even." "He is," Charlotte said gently. "And he should be. But fear can guide growth, too." Victoria glanced at her lap. "Maybe he's like me, someone who forgot how to see others clearly." Charlotte didn't disagree. The aircraft glided smoothly ahead, cutting through the sky with quiet certainty. The turbulence was behind them, but the emotional shaking lingered fuel for reflection rather than fear. Charlotte opened her notebook again and wrote, "Growth begins when truth hurts more than pride." Victoria watched her write, then whispered, "Can I change?" Charlotte's answer was simple, steady, and soft enough to fit in the hush of the cabin. "Yes, if you want to." And for the first time in hours, Victoria breathed without trembling. Somewhere high above the Midwest, the night began to thin. The dark horizon softened into a muted blue, the earliest hint of dawn stretching along the edge of the world. Though most passengers remained asleep, the cabin felt subtly different, as if preparing itself for a shift that had nothing to do with sunrise. Charlotte Hayes had not slept. She didn't feel tired, but she felt full of thoughts, full of questions, full of the emotional residue left by the evening's events. Her conversation with Victoria lingered in her mind, not as a burden, but as something necessary, something honest. Forgiveness was a path, not a moment, and change, she knew, often took root in the darkest hours before dawn. In the galley, Ethan Clark stood alone, leaning against the counter with both hands braced firmly. His head hung slightly, shoulders stiff beneath the pressed uniform. The overhead light cast a pale glow on his tense expression. He stared at his reflection in the small metal cabinet. The reflection stared back with disappointment and confusion. He whispered under his breath, "How did I get it so wrong?" He replayed everything the moment he approached Charlotte, the tone he used, the assumptions he made, the authority he overclaimed. Every instruction in the manual told him to treat passengers with dignity, and yet tonight he had failed spectacularly when it mattered most. Footsteps approached, slow but steady. Maria stepped into the galley, rubbing her arms lightly for warmth. She looked over at him. "You haven't moved in 20 minutes, she murmured. "I don't deserve to," he replied quietly. Maria sighed. "Punishing yourself won't fix anything. I humiliated someone who trusted us," he said. "Not just any someone. The CEO. That's not why you're shaken," she replied gently. "You're shaken because you crossed a line you didn't think you were capable of crossing. That's different." Ethan closed his eyes briefly, absorbing her words. He shook his head. "I don't know how to face her after this." Maria stepped closer. "You face her by taking responsibility, with humility. She's tough, but she's fair." He let out a shaky breath. "I don't know if fair will be enough to save me." Maria hesitated. Sometimes saving yourself means accepting the consequences. Ethan looked down. "I'm scared." "Maria." She touched his arm gently. "Of course you are. Fear means you care." They were silent for a moment. "Finally," Maria said. "She's awake, if you're wondering." Ethan stiffened. "I'm not ready." "Then get ready," Maria said softly, "because sunrise comes whether we're prepared or not." Meanwhile, in the cabin, Charlotte turned her notebook page, writing slowly, letting each sentence settle before adding the next. Leadership requires patience with others and with yourself. The world bends toward dignity, but only if people choose it. Moments later, she closed the notebook and rested it on her tray. She rubbed her eyes gently, letting the dim light soothe them. Across the aisle, Victoria was awake too, sitting quietly. Her posture changed. Her spine wasn't rigid. Her expression wasn't defensive. Her hands rested loosely in her lap, no longer clenched. She had the look of someone who had been emptied and refilled with something unfamiliar. Awareness. When she noticed Charlotte looking in her direction, she offered a small, hesitant nod. It wasn't forced. It wasn't a plea. It was acknowledgement, a silent thank you, a silent apology, both wrapped in humility. Charlotte returned the nod, Not warmly, not coldly, simply honestly. Behind them, the elderly woman from earlier stirred, stretching gently before opening her eyes. She spotted Charlotte watching the sunrise and smiled. "It's different up here," the woman whispered. "Dawn. It always feels closer." Charlotte nodded. "It does." "Long night?" the woman asked softly. "Yes," Charlotte replied, "but a necessary one." The woman folded her blanket. "Growth usually happens on nights like this." Charlotte smiled slightly, recognizing the truth in the words. The cabin began to wake slowly. Daniel shifted in 2A, rubbing his eyes, stretching his legs before sitting upright. He glanced toward Charlotte and smiled sleepily. She nodded back, appreciating the grounded, good-hearted presence he brought to the space. Michael Langford woke next, glancing toward his wife. He seemed relieved to see her calmer, though confused by the softness in her expression. "You okay?" he asked quietly. Victoria nodded. "Better." He studied her. "You look different." She inhaled slowly. "I feel different." He managed a small, relieved smile. "That's good." His voice was quiet, but Charlotte caught it. She was glad for him. People often underestimated the influence of gentle spouses. Charlotte took another sip of water, then noticed the captain approaching from the front of the cabin. He stopped at her row with a polite smile. "Good morning, Ms. Hayes. We'll be landing in about 90 minutes. Conditions are clear." "Thank you, Captain," she replied. He hesitated. "May I ask how you're feeling?" Charlotte considered the question. It wasn't procedural. It was human, thoughtful. She answered. "Reflective." He nodded. "Understandable." Then his expression softened. "If you would like a private space to speak with the crew before we land, I can make that available." Charlotte appreciated the gesture. "I'll let you know." He inclined his head and stepped away. Victoria watched him go, then looked back at Charlotte. "He respects you," she said softly. "Respect is built over time," Charlotte replied, not demanded in the moment. Victoria absorbed that quietly. After a long pause, she whispered, "Ms. Hayes, if you speak with Ethan, please don't be too hard on him." Charlotte met her gaze. Why Victoria hesitated? Because he tried to help me, and I put him in a terrible position. I shouldn't have. Not again. Charlotte raised an eyebrow slightly. Again, Victoria looked down at her hands. People cater to me. Too much. I expect it. They give in. Even when it's wrong. Tonight, I saw the cost of that. Charlotte listened carefully. Victoria continued in a shaky voice. He was only trying to satisfy a customer who made unreasonable demands. That customer was me. Charlotte exhaled slowly. That doesn't erase his responsibility. I know, Victoria whispered. But maybe I'm responsible for some of his choices too. Charlotte appreciated the honesty more than she let on. "I'll consider what you've said," she replied gently. Victoria's shoulders relaxed, as if she had been holding her breath. The sky outside continued to brighten, painting the cabin in warm, early rays. Something about the new light made everything feel a little clearer, a little softer, a little more possible. A new day often did that. Charlotte looked down the aisle toward the galley, sensing the weight waiting there. It was nearly time to speak with Ethan, but she wasn't ready yet. She needed the last few moments of quiet before stepping into another role, the role that demanded strength, clarity, grace. She was willing, but she wanted to enter that moment with calm, not emotion. Closing her eyes briefly, she steadied her breath. 3 counts in, 3 counts out. Calm was a discipline, and she had trained long for it. The eastern sky had opened fully by the time Charlotte Hayes rose from her seat. Sunlight spilled softly through the cabin, catching the edges of headrests and the glint of metal fixtures. Morning had arrived with a quiet certainty, bringing with it the moment she had been preparing for all night. She walked with steady steps toward the galley. Passengers barely noticed her passing, though a few tracked her with curious eyes. Something in the atmosphere signaled that an important conversation was about to unfold. Maria Cortez met her just before she reached the galley curtain. She didn't speak yet, only gave a tiny nod, an unspoken acknowledgement that this was the right time. Charlotte returned the nod. Maria stepped aside. Ethan Clark stood waiting. His uniform was neat, but his posture held the unmistakable stiffness of a man bracing for impact. He kept his eyes lowered, hands clasped behind him in a manner that looked more military than airline standard. When he finally lifted his gaze, Charlotte saw fear there, but she also saw sincerity. "Ms. Hayes," he said softly. "Thank you for speaking with me." Charlotte studied him for a moment before responding. "Ethan, this is a conversation we need to have, not as punishment, but as understanding." He swallowed. "I'm prepared for both." She motioned toward the jump seat. "Sit, if you need to." He shook his head. "I'd rather stand." Charlotte folded her hands gently in front of her. "Then let's begin." He took a slow breath. "I owe you a direct apology. Not a scripted one. A real one. Last night, I acted out of bias and assumption. I let pressure twist my judgment. I tried to assert authority I didn't have, and I used a tone that no passenger deserves." Charlotte listened without interrupting. Ethan continued, voice cracking under its own weight. "I don't know how I became someone capable of that, but I did, and I'm ashamed." Charlotte took in his words thoughtfully. "Shame can be useful," she said after a long pause, "if it leads to transformation." He nodded quickly. "That's what I want. To change. To be better." Charlotte held his gaze. "What were you thinking when you approached me last night?" He winced at the question. "I saw a demanding customer. A wealthy woman with status. I saw her frustration. And I saw you as someone alone. Someone I thought wouldn't push back. Someone I assumed didn't belong in that seat." The confession hit the air with the weight of something raw and unfiltered. Charlotte let the silence stretch. Ethan lowered his eyes. "I'm not proud of that." "You shouldn't be," Charlotte replied gently. "But honesty is the first step. You've taken it." A faint tremor ran through him. "I don't expect forgiveness." Charlotte tilted her head slightly. "Forgiveness is not something you demand or even request. It's something you earn through different choices tomorrow." He nodded, absorbing the meaning of her words. Charlotte stepped closer, her tone steady but never cruel. "Ethan, I need you to understand that what happened wasn't just a procedural failure. It was a human one. You made assumptions rooted in something deeper than policy. Bias doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it shows up in quiet decisions, in quick judgments we don't question." His eyes glistened. "I know, and I hate that I let it steer me. For now," Charlotte said softly, "I need to know if you're willing to unlearn the things that led you there." Ethan straightened. "Yes. Absolutely." She studied his face for several seconds. "Why?" He hesitated, then answered honestly. "Because I don't want to be the kind of person who hurts someone who looks like you, someone who looks like many of our passengers. I don't want to be someone who repeats patterns I grew up seeing." Charlotte felt something shift inside her. There it was, the root. Not excuses, not self-defense, just truth. "We're not born with prejudice," she said with quiet conviction. "We absorb it, but we can also refuse it. That refusal is work, "I'm ready to work," he whispered. Maria, standing at a respectful distance, softened visibly. Charlotte let out a gentle breath. "Ethan, you will face consequences. Professional ones. They're necessary. But they don't have to define the rest of your life." He nodded, shoulders trembling. "Whatever comes, I'll accept it." Charlotte placed a hand briefly over her heart. "Good, because growth begins where denial ends." He blinked rapidly, trying to hold composure. "Thank you for speaking to me. You didn't have to." "Yes," Charlotte said, "I did. Leaders don't walk away from uncomfortable truths." A pause hung between them, full of morning light and possibility. Suddenly, a soft voice spoke from behind the curtain. "Ms. Hayes." Victoria Langford stood there, hesitant, wringing her hands slightly. Ethan stepped back instinctively, giving space. Victoria swallowed. "I didn't mean to interrupt." "You didn't," Charlotte said kindly. "Do you need something?" Victoria's eyes flicked toward Ethan. "I just wanted to say something. To him. If that's all right?" Charlotte looked at Ethan. "Are you willing?" He nodded. "Yes." Victoria stepped closer, voice gentle and fragile. "Ethan, I put you in a terrible position. I used my status to push for something I knew was wrong. That pressure didn't excuse what you did, but it contributed." Ethan was stunned. "Mrs. Langford, you don't need to." "But I do," she insisted softly. "Because if I want to be better, I need to own my part." Charlotte watched the exchange, struck by how much had shifted in a single night. Victoria took a breath. "I'm trying to learn too, and I'm sorry," Ethan whispered. "Thank you." Charlotte felt the cabin tilt into a new equilibrium. This was what growth looked like: messy, humble, imperfect, but real. Moments later, an announcement crackled softly over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain. We will begin our initial descent into JFK shortly. Please remain seated as the crew prepares the cabin." The conversation had reached its natural end. Charlotte gave Ethan one last measured look. "Make today the beginning, not the apology." He nodded firmly. "I will." She stepped out of the galley, allowing him space to breathe and process. As she walked back to her seat, the earlier tension of the cabin had transformed into something quieter, something almost tender. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was movement. And movement mattered. Passengers were adjusting their seats, pulling down tray tables, stretching limbs stiff from the long night. Morning sunlight painted the rows in gold. Daniel offered her a warm smile. The elderly woman gave her a reassuring nod. Victoria eased back into her seat, looking steadier than she had in hours. Michael reached over, touching his wife's hand gently, and Charlotte felt the aircraft settle into its descent, carrying with it the weight of a night that had changed everyone in subtle but irrevocable ways. JFK awaited. So did accountability. But for the first time since the confrontation began, the burden on Charlotte's chest felt lighter. Growth had entered the cabin, and it was staying. The soft chime echoed through the cabin as the aircraft began its descent. The morning sun, now bright enough to cast delicate reflections across the polished surfaces inside. Passengers adjusted seat backs, straightened their belongings, and exchanged the quiet murmurs that always came before landing. There was anticipation in the air, but also something heavier, something unspoken that clung to the space like leftover turbulence. Charlotte Hayes fastened her belt and exhaled deeply. She felt present, grounded, ready. The conversations of the night had taken her through a range of emotions: hurt, disappointment, resolve, compassion, and now, as the wheels prepared to meet the earth again, she sensed the moment ahead would demand a different kind of strength. Beside her, The elderly woman sat serenely, hands folded on her lap. She leaned slightly toward Charlotte and whispered, "Some truths land harder than planes." Charlotte gave a faint smile. "Yes, they do." Across the aisle, Victoria Langford adjusted her blouse, smoothing it with trembling fingers. Michael watched her closely, not with worry, but with admiration. He had recognized the shift in her long before anyone else. Change rarely happened in an instant, but in Victoria's eyes, it had begun. At the front of the cabin, Ethan Clark and Maria Cortez completed their landing checks. Ethan's face held the solemnity of someone preparing to face the consequences he knew he deserved. Maria's expression was calm, but protective, like a senior soldier walking beside a younger one into a difficult moment. The aircraft dipped lower. The skyline of New York appeared through the windows, tall towers silhouetted against the rising sun, a world waking beneath them. Passengers straightened. Conversations stilled. A soft jolt. The wheels touched the runway with a smooth roll. Landing. A brief cheer rose from a few seats. A common ritual of relief. Then came the familiar voice of Captain Andrew Foster. "Welcome to New York City. We thank you for flying with us. Please remain seated until the aircraft has come to a complete stop at the gate." But this time, the cabin held an unusual tension. It wasn't fear, it was awareness. Awareness that something important was about to unfold. Charlotte waited patiently as the plane taxied to the gate. Victoria glanced at her several times, as if unsure whether to speak again or to stay silent. "Eventually," she whispered, "will you talk to the crew now?" Charlotte nodded gently. "There will be a conversation." Victoria bit her lip. "I hope it's fair." "It will be," Charlotte assured. The airplane slowed, then fully stopped. The jet bridge extended toward the door. Maria opened the exit with practiced efficiency. The cool morning air drifted inside. "Thank you for flying with us," she said warmly. As passengers began rising from their seats, Charlotte stayed seated for a moment, letting them move ahead. She knew what came next. Visibility, recognition, the revealing of hierarchy. A few passengers were already whispering, "That's the CEO. Someone said she saved a woman during turbulence." "No, she was involved in something with the crew. She looks so calm." "Wait, that's Charlotte Hayes." The ripple grew quickly, the way a breeze sweeps through tall grass. Charlotte stood finally, gathering her notebook and bag. She stepped into the aisle. The reaction was immediate. A man near row 3 blinked in shock. "Ma'am, are you really—" Charlotte offered a polite nod. "Yes, I'm Charlotte Hayes." Several passengers straightened their posture, embarrassed by earlier assumptions. Others smiled with admiration. Some simply stared, taking in the irony of the events they hadn't fully witnessed. The elderly woman raised her voice just enough to be heard by those nearby. "Our world would be kinder if more people looked beyond appearances." Charlotte touched her arm gently in appreciation. Victoria and Michael were still in their seats. Victoria slowly rose, turning toward Charlotte with a mixture of awe, regret, and respect. "You walk differently than most leaders," Victoria said softly. "Not above people, but with them." Charlotte held her gaze. "That's the only way change lasts." Michael stepped forward. "Thank you for giving us a better morning than we deserved." Charlotte didn't reply with grandeur, only with sincerity. "Travel safely." As she turned to continue toward the exit, Daniel from 2A approached her. "I just wanted to say, the way you handled everything, it meant a lot," he said. "More than you know." Charlotte nodded. "Thank you for your kindness last night." It set a tone the cabin needed. He smiled, touched by the acknowledgement. Outside the aircraft, the jet bridge bustled with uniformed staff, Several airline managers stood waiting, alerted earlier by the captain that the CEO was on board. Their faces carried a blend of curiosity and alertness, leaders preparing to support or respond, depending on what she needed. As Charlotte stepped out, they greeted her formally. "Good morning, Ms. Hayes. Welcome back to JFK. We're prepared for whatever briefing you'd like." Charlotte gave them a calm nod. "Before any formal briefing, I need a private space with the cabin crew." "Yes, of course," one manager said quickly. "This way?" Ethan and Maria followed behind her, walking side by side. Ethan looked as though every step carried the weight of a confession still echoing through his bones. Maria remained composed, though her concern for him was visible in her eyes. Before entering the private room, Charlotte turned. A cluster of passengers lingered near the gate area, still whispering. "That's her, the CEO. She was in first class." No, she gave up her seat. Who does that? Someone who leads differently. Victoria and Michael stood slightly apart from the group. Victoria watched Charlotte with an expression that was no longer fear, no longer entitlement, but something like gratitude wrapped in humility. Charlotte offered a single, steady nod in their direction. Victoria placed a hand over her heart in return. Inside the private room, the door closed softly behind them. It was a quiet space, small, purpose-built for confidential conversations between crew and leadership. A table, 4 chairs, neutral lighting, nothing to distract from the purpose. Charlotte motioned for Ethan and Maria to sit. She remained standing for a moment, grounding the room with her presence. "We're not here for punishment," she said. "We're here for truth." Ethan swallowed. Maria straightened her posture. Charlotte continued, her voice calm but unwavering. "Last night was a failure in judgment, but it was also an opportunity. Growth is born in uncomfortable spaces. You both stepped into discomfort, and that matters." Ethan's voice trembled. "Thank you for giving me the chance." Charlotte sat finally, folding her hands. "You'll receive a formal review. There will be corrective measures, but this isn't an ending. It's a beginning." His eyes brightened not with relief, but with determination. "I won't waste it," he said. "I expect you won't," Charlotte replied. Maria exhaled quietly, relief softening her shoulders. A knock sounded from the door. A manager peeked inside respectfully. "Ms. Hayes' press is gathering near the terminal entrance. Rumors are circulating. They may request a comment." Charlotte absorbed that without surprise. "Let them wait," she said. "Some truths need the right time." She dismissed the crew gently, allowing them space to breathe again. When she stepped out into the terminal, the morning light pouring through the glass walls felt symbolic. She had landed. The truth had landed. And now, the world would see what came next. The terminal outside the private room buzzed with the familiar rhythm of morning traffic, rolling suitcases, scattered conversations, echoing footsteps. But woven into that ordinary backdrop was something sharper, something that hummed with curiosity. A small crowd had gathered near the glass entryway, holding phones loosely at their sides, trying not to stare too openly, yet unable to look away. Word traveled quickly in airports, faster than boarding calls, faster than weather alerts. A CEO on a commercial flight was already notable. A CEO at the center of an incident that was fuel for whispers. Charlotte Hayes stepped into this atmosphere with calm precision, her notebook tucked beneath her arm, her bag hanging from her shoulder, her posture steady. The earlier fatigue from the long flight seemed absorbed into a deeper well of composure. Maria Cortez exited the room behind her, while Ethan Clark remained inside for a moment, breathing deeply as though preparing himself for a new kind of day. Charlotte paused to give him that moment. He deserved that space. The managers formed a loose circle around her, not as shields, but as facilitators for whatever came next. But Charlotte didn't want a wall. She walked forward with an ease that signaled clarity rather than intimidation. Several passengers who had deplaned earlier spotted her immediately. There she is. That's the woman from first class. No, she's the CEO, the actual CEO. She helped that lady during the turbulence. She handled the crew situation too. She was so calm. I didn't even know who she was. The blend of awe and disbelief hung in the air. Charlotte lifted her chin slightly, acknowledging their presence without feeding the spectacle. She had long ago learned that visibility was part of leadership, but being seen was different from being exposed. Victoria Langford and her husband Michael waited a few steps away. Victoria looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in the quiet humility that had settled into her posture. She appeared unsure whether she should approach. Before she could decide, the first flash of a camera lit the space. Someone had taken a photo. Then another. Then a whisper rose loudly enough to cut through the terminal, "That's Charlotte Hayes, CEO of Aurora Air." Charlotte didn't flinch. She simply kept walking. But the energy shifted quickly. Phones lifted. People leaned in. A thin ring of observers began forming as though absorbing her into their orbit. Airports were strange ecosystems, half anonymity, half spotlight. Anyone could become the center of attention for reasons they never chose. A small girl's voice suddenly pierced the murmur. "Mommy, Mommy. That's her. That's the lady from the magazine." Charlotte turned instinctively. A young black girl, no more than 8, stood near a row of seats, eyes wide and shining. Her mother looked startled, holding her daughter's hand as if unsure whether she should encourage or restrain her excitement. The little girl wriggled free before the mother could respond. She ran small sneakers tapping against the polished floor straight toward Charlotte. Charlotte froze, surprised by the speed and innocence of the moment. The child skidded to a stop right in front of her, breathless and awestruck. "Are you really her?" the girl asked, voice loud enough for the nearby crowd to hear. "Are you really Charlotte Hayes?" Charlotte bent slightly, lowering herself to the child's height. "Yes," she said softly. "I am." The little girl exhaled a squeal of joy. "I read about you in school. You were the first black woman CEO of a major airline. My teacher said you make dreams look possible." Charlotte felt something tighten in her chest. It wasn't pain. It was recognition of what her presence meant, of who watched her, of why she carried herself the way she did. The girl continued. "I told my class I want to be like you one day." Charlotte smiled, warmth spreading through her voice. "You can be better than me." The little girl's eyes widened even further. "Really?" "Yes," Charlotte replied, "and I'll be cheering for you when you do." Several bystanders gasped softly, touched by the exchange. Phones lifted again, not with gossip this time, but with admiration. For a moment, the tension in the terminal softened into something gentler. The girl threw her arms around Charlotte without hesitation. Charlotte hugged her back carefully, respectfully, fully aware of the symbolic weight of the moment. Behind them, Victoria Langford watched. Her eyes glistened not with jealousy or confusion, but with a profound understanding she had never reached before. She saw the difference now. Not between herself and Charlotte, but between borrowed status and earned respect, between privilege and purpose, between being feared and being admired. Michael placed a supportive hand on Victoria's back. He whispered, "This is what leadership looks like." Victoria nodded slowly, tears gathering in her lashes. The girl's mother hurried forward, breathless. "I'm so sorry, Miss Hayes." She just ran. I didn't want to. Charlotte stood and smiled. "No apology needed. She made my morning." The mother sighed with relief, then gently grasped her daughter's hand. "Say thank you." The girl waved vigorously. "Thank you, and I'm gonna be amazing too." Charlotte chuckled. I don't doubt that. As they walked away, a manager approached her. Ms. Hayes, the media is gathering near the exit. They're asking for a statement. She expected that. She had always known public exposure followed private leadership. What are they asking? She inquired calmly. They've heard there was an incident on board involving a VIP passenger and a crew member. Some think it was racially motivated. Others think it was a security issue. Rumors are running. Rumors always ran faster than truth. Do you want to address them? The manager asked carefully. Yes, Charlotte said. But not to feed the spectacle. Another ripple passed through the crowd as Charlotte stepped toward the escalator leading to the main terminal floor. Cameras clicked again. At the top of the escalator, she paused. Not because of the cameras, not because of the whispers, but because she sensed someone behind her gathering the courage to speak. It was Victoria. She approached slowly, hands clasped together. Her voice trembled, but her gaze held steady. Ms. Hayes, she said quietly. I need to say something before the crowd swallows us. Charlotte turned toward her fully. Go ahead. Victoria inhaled, fighting for the right words. Watching you with that girl, it showed me everything I've been missing. All the things I've mistaken for strength were just walls. You're strong in a way I've never understood. Charlotte didn't interrupt. Victoria continued. And I want you to know, I'm not the same person who boarded that flight. I won't pretend I'm fixed, but I'm awake now. Charlotte held her gaze gently. Growth takes time, but you've begun. Victoria nodded, wiping at her eyes. Thank you for not giving up on the moment. Even when I didn't deserve grace, Charlotte answered softly. Everyone deserves the chance to change. Not everyone takes it. Victoria absorbed those words with visible emotion. Before Charlotte could say more, a cluster of reporters spilled into view at the bottom of the escalator. There she is, Ms. Hayes. We've heard there was an incident. Can you confirm what happened with your seat last night? Was this a racial issue? Did the crew mistreat you? Are you launching an internal investigation? The chaos swirled like a storm. Charlotte stepped forward, planting her feet with quiet authority. She didn't speak yet. She simply lifted her head, letting the morning light fall across her face. The silence she commanded was stronger than any headline. For a moment, that felt longer than it truly was. Charlotte Hayes stood at the top of the escalator, watching the sea of microphones, cameras, and expectant faces gather below. The terminal noise settled in waves around her, yet the space immediately surrounding her remained still, suspended between anticipation and revelation. She adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, took a breath in the quiet way leaders did when preparing to reshape a narrative, then stepped forward. Reporters surged closer, but airport security created a respectful buffer, allowing enough room for Charlotte to speak without chaos. A cluster of passengers who had witnessed the earlier cabin tension drifted to the edges of the crowd, drawn by the gravity of the moment. A journalist in a slate blue suit raised her voice first. Ms. Hayes, can you confirm whether you were the center of an onboard seating conflict last night? Another question followed immediately. Was there racial profiling involved? Then another. Are disciplinary actions being taken against your staff? Charlotte lifted her hand not abruptly, but with a gentleness that somehow commanded more silence than any raised voice could. Before I answer, she began. Let me say this clearly. No single moment defines an entire airline. What matters is how we respond, how we learn, and how we make sure every passenger and every crew member is treated with the dignity they deserve. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Softer now, more focused. Charlotte continued. Last night, an interaction occurred that raised difficult questions. Those questions are valid. They touch on issues many people face every day: bias, assumptions, and the quiet ways people are sometimes diminished without anyone meaning harm. Her voice carried the calm of someone speaking truth without hostility. She added, "It would be easy to blame one person or create a villain, but the deeper responsibility is to ensure systems and training help prevent moments like this before they begin." Cameras clicked rapidly. The reporters leaned in. "Ms. Hayes," another journalist asked. "Were you mistreated personally?" Charlotte answered without hesitation. "I was spoken to in a way that did not reflect our company's values. And, yes, bias played a part. But this isn't about punishing people for being imperfect. It's about helping people become better." A hush fell. This was not the answer they were expecting. Charlotte continued, voice firm yet unmistakably compassionate. "The crew member involved has already taken responsibility, genuine responsibility. That matters. Accountability must be paired with the opportunity to learn." The reporter in the blue suit tried again. "But you're the CEO. Shouldn't there be consequences?" "There will be," Charlotte replied. "Consequences appropriate to what happened. But consequences alone don't build equity. Growth does." Her words echoed across the terminal like a steadying bell. Passengers nearby nodded silently. A few whispered their agreement. Another reporter raised her voice. "Can you tell us how the incident began?" Before Charlotte could respond, a soft voice behind her spoke. "I can." The crowd shifted. Victoria Langford stepped forward, her hands trembling slightly but her gaze clear. Michael walked just behind her, steady and supportive. The reporters immediately recognized her from earlier mentions within the terminal. All at once, attention split between both women, the one in power and the one who had misused hers. Victoria inhaled shakily and moved closer, stopping beside Charlotte. She didn't stand behind her or shrink away. She stood beside her, an intentional act that made her vulnerability public. She faced the cameras. "The incident began because of me," she said. "I made a request that I had no right to make. I used my privilege and my frustration to pressure the crew into something I shouldn't have asked for, and I regret it deeply." A few reporters gasped softly. Even Charlotte turned her head slightly, surprised by the courage in the gesture. Victoria continued, voice cracking but strong in its honesty. "I assumed I was more important than another passenger. I assumed I was owed something because of who I thought I was. But I learned very quickly that who I am isn't determined by status. It's determined by character." A silence, heavy yet cleansing, spread through the terminal. She added, "And Ms. Hayes showed me a kind of strength I've never understood: strength without arrogance, authority without cruelty. She treated me with more dignity than I offered her." Charlotte listened, not rescuing her, not correcting her, simply witnessing her transformation. Victoria bowed her head slightly. "Whatever story is told about last night, I want it known that the fault was mine." The crowd was stunned. A man in the back whispered, "She didn't have to say that." A woman near the front murmured, "Maybe she needed to." Charlotte stepped forward again, gently guiding the narrative back into equilibrium. "Thank you, Mrs. Langford," she said quietly. "Accountability is powerful when it comes from honesty." Victoria nodded, tears in her lashes. Charlotte turned back to the press. "I want to make something clear. What happened on that flight reflects broader challenges in our society. Challenges we all have a responsibility to confront. At Aurora Air, we are committed to training that addresses bias, teaches empathy, and reinforces dignity as a non-negotiable standard." Another question rose. "Ms. Hayes, what happens next?" Charlotte thought for only a moment. "What happens next is growth," she said. for our crew, for our policies, for our passengers, and for our industry. We will review the incident thoroughly. We will support our staff as they learn from it, and we will continue building an airline where every person is treated with respect without exception. It was the kind of statement that wasn't crafted to avoid scandal, but to invite responsibility. A final question came, almost hesitant. Ms. Hayes, how do you stay so calm in moments like this? Charlotte offered a small, knowing smile. Because I carry more than myself, she replied. I carry every person who has ever been spoken to as if they didn't belong. Every child who needs to see what dignity looks like, and every leader who needs to be reminded that strength begins with humility. It wasn't a slogan. It wasn't a soundbite. It was a truth she had lived. The terminal responded not with applause, but with quiet reverence, a feeling more powerful than noise. Charlotte nodded respectfully, signaling the end of the impromptu briefing. Security gently parted the crowd as she stepped away from the cameras. Behind her, Victoria watched with gratitude and renewed resolve. Michael placed an arm around his wife, recognizing the courage it took for her to stand in that spotlight honestly. Maria Cortez emerged from a nearby corridor, eyes shining with pride for her CEO, and from the corner of the terminal. The small girl who had run to Charlotte earlier waved shyly. Charlotte lifted her hand in return. What came next would require follow-through, meetings, policies, and hard conversations. But for this moment, truth had found a place to land safely. The morning crowds at JFK continued to swell behind Charlotte Hayes as she stepped away from the press, weaving through the terminal with steady, unhurried steps. The adrenaline of the moment dissipated gradually, leaving behind a quieter, deeper sensation, like the echo of a long conversation that would stay with her far beyond this place. Her managers walked a few paces behind her, giving her respectful distance. Maria Cortez caught up eventually, her expression warm but cautious, as though she didn't want to intrude on whatever thoughts Charlotte was holding close. Ms. Hayes, Maria said softly. That was extraordinary. Charlotte stopped near a wide window overlooking the runway. Sunlight spilled across the floor, illuminating the aircraft lined up like silent guardians of the morning. It was necessary, Charlotte answered. Extraordinary moments are usually just necessary ones that people are afraid to face. Maria nodded slowly. Still, you handled it with such grace. Charlotte smiled gently. Grace is a choice, and a practice. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, the kind that didn't demand explanation or fill itself with noise. A familiar voice approached from behind. Ms. Hayes, may I speak with you? Ethan Clark stood a few feet away, his uniform immaculate but his expression still carrying the weight of the night's introspection. He held his hat in his hands, gripping it like a fragile relic. Charlotte turned to face him fully. Of course. He approached, each step careful, respectful. When he reached her, he squared his shoulders. I wanted to thank you. He began quietly. Not for forgiveness. I know that's not something that happens quickly, but for the chance to grow. Charlotte watched him, recognizing sincerity in his posture. Ethan continued. When I woke up this morning, I was terrified of losing my job, of disappointing people, of being exposed as someone I don't want to be. But after everything you said, I feel something different. And what's that? Charlotte asked gently. Responsibility. He replied, not punishment. Responsibility to be better than I was yesterday. Charlotte let those words settle in the air. That's the beginning of real change. Ethan, not in your job, but in your character. He swallowed hard. I won't forget this chance. I hope you don't, she said. The people who grow the most are often the ones who stumble early. His eyes softened with emotion. "Thank you, Ms. Hayes." She nodded once, and with that, he stepped back and walked away, shoulders still heavy, but his step steadier than before. Maria exhaled softly. "He'll be all right. He will," Charlotte said. "Growth rarely feels comfortable." A few moments passed before another presence approached, hesitant, gentle, uncertain. Victoria Langford. Her husband, Michael, kept a few paces behind her, giving her the space to walk alone. Victoria's face carried no trace of the entitlement she had displayed on the plane. Instead, it reflected humility shaped by a long night of reckoning. A night she would likely remember for the rest of her life. "Ms. Hayes," she said quietly. "Victoria," Charlotte replied in the same tone. "I came to say goodbye," Victoria said, "and to thank you." Charlotte tilted her head, listening. "I know today isn't about me," Victoria continued, "but I want you to know that what happened forced me to see things I didn't want to see in myself. Ugly things. Selfish things. I'd been telling myself for years that kindness was weakness, that I had to defend my place in the world. But the truth is, I wasn't defending anything. I was hiding behind it." Charlotte didn't interrupt. She knew this kind of confession wasn't offered lightly. Victoria swallowed. "Last night changed me. And I don't say that lightly. I don't expect you to believe it yet. But I'm committed to making sure my daughter, if I ever have one, doesn't grow up learning the same harmful lessons I did." Charlotte's expression softened. "Change doesn't erase the past, Victoria, but it can shape the future, and that is worth something." Tears welled in Victoria's eyes. "I hope one day I can show you that this mattered to me." "You already have," Charlotte replied simply. Victoria let out a trembling breath. "Travel safely, Ms. Hayes." "You as well," Charlotte said gently. Michael stepped forward, offering Charlotte a respectful nod before guiding his wife toward the terminal exit. As they disappeared into the bustling morning, Charlotte felt a surprising calm settle over her. She returned her gaze to the runway, where a new aircraft had just touched down. Its wheels kicking up a faint mist of water left from overnight dew, it glided forward with a rhythmic precision, almost symbolic in its arrival. Maria stepped closer. "You ready to head out?" "In a moment," Charlotte replied. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the hum of the terminal wash over her, the footsteps, the rolling bags, the distant announcements, the soft chatter of travelers moving toward their destinations. Leadership meant being seen, but it also meant carrying what wasn't visible. Responsibility. Representation. The unspoken weight of every young girl who looked at her and saw a mirror. A soft voice approached again. "Excuse me, Ms. Hayes." It was the little girl from earlier, clutching her mother's hand. Charlotte knelt slightly so she was level with her. "Hello again." The girl smiled shyly. "My mom said I could ask you something." "Of course," Charlotte replied. The girl hesitated, then asked with hopeful innocence, "Do you ever get scared? Like, scared of being in charge?" Charlotte's heart tightened not with sadness, but with understanding deeper than words could express. "Yes," Charlotte said gently, "I get scared sometimes. Being in charge means making choices that matter, but being scared doesn't mean you're not strong. It means you care." The girl's face brightened. "So, I can still be like you even if I'm scared." Charlotte smiled, warm and full. "Especially if you're scared. Courage isn't about never feeling fear. It's about choosing to do the right thing anyway." The girl nodded firmly, as if receiving a message meant for her alone. Her mother thanked Charlotte softly, and together they walked away. Hand in hand. Maria watched them go. "You know, you changed her life." Charlotte shook her head gently. She changed mine. Maria's smile widened, touched by the honesty of that truth. A manager approached. Your car is ready whenever you are. Miss A? Hayes. Thank you, Charlotte said. She gathered her things and took one last look at the terminal, the place where tension, truth, accountability, and healing had all converged. Then she walked toward the exit, sunlight glimmering across the polished floor. Every step felt like a promise not to perfection, but to growth, not to authority, but to dignity, not to power, but to humanity. Outside. The breeze greeted her with a cool morning softness. The world beyond the terminal stretched wide and full of possibility. Charlotte inhaled deeply, letting the air fill her lungs. She was ready for the work ahead, and she was hopeful. Not because the world was perfect, but because people could change, and because healing quiet, steady. Courageous healing was always possible when truth had room to breathe. The story of a black woman who was asked to give up her VIP seat, only to reveal her true identity as the CEO of an airline, is not just a shocking twist. It is a mirror reflecting an old but still existing truth. People often judge each other by their appearance, skin color, status, instead of their character. But what makes this story powerful is not the exposure or the revenge. It's how she faces it calmly, level-headedly, and with dignity. She doesn't scream. She doesn't humiliate anyone. She just lets the truth speak and lets each person face it for themselves. As we mature, we understand that true power lies not in being able to dominate others, but in being able to control ourselves. Our compassion, empathy, and how we treat those less fortunate are the measures of our worth. This story reminds us of something simple, yet profound. Be kind before you succeed. Be respectful before you judge. And remember that you never know who you're dealing with. It could be a CEO, a teacher, or just a human being who deserves to be treated with kindness. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this story. If it made you think, if it reminded you of a moment that made your heart sink or made you stand up stronger, I appreciate every second you spent with me. Please like, share, and subscribe to the channel to help meaningful stories continue to spread. Thank you, and hope to see you again on the next journey.